Imagine you are standing in a crowded room. People are laughing, shouting, and speaking English at 1,000 miles per hour. You feel your heart racing. You think, I can't do this. I'm too quiet. I'm not fast enough. Well, what if I told you that being quiet is actually your secret weapon for fluency? Welcome to Speak English with Luna. Today, we are exploring the introvert advantage in language learning. I'm here with Oliver Bennett, an expert in mindful communication. Oliver, take us back to that moment you were telling me about, the gala.
It was 5 years ago at a massive tech gala in New York. The lights were blinding and the room was buzzing with high-level executives. As an introvert, I felt completely out of place. I was holding my glass of water, watching everyone compete to see who could speak the loudest. I felt like a failure because I wasn't performing like them. But then, something shifted. I stopped trying to talk and started truly listening. I noticed the nuances in their tone, the words they repeated, and the gaps in their logic. While they were busy making noise, I was building a map of the conversation. When I finally spoke, just one sentence, the entire table went silent. They listened because I had perspective.
That is incredible. That map you mentioned is exactly what we're talking about today. Introverts aren't shy, they are strategic. Oliver, that story about the gala is so powerful. I think many of our listeners feel overwhelmed when they try to speak English in groups. They look at extroverts and think, I wish I could talk that much. But you're saying that being a listener is actually a shortcut to fluency?
Exactly, Luna. Think about it this way. When you are the loudest person in the room, you are only repeating what you already know. You aren't learning anything new. But when you are quiet, you are gathering data. You are noticing how native speakers connect their words. You're picking up on intonation and natural pauses. It's like being a detective.
A detective. I love that. For our intermediate learners, this is a total game changer. You don't need to speak 100 words a minute to be successful. In fact, speaking less might make you better. Let's stop for our first vocabulary checkpoint.
Our first word is overwhelmed. It means feeling like something is too much to handle. If an English conversation feels too fast, you feel overwhelmed. Our second word is observe. To observe is to watch and listen carefully. When you observe, you learn the rhythm of the language. And finally, meaningful. A meaningful conversation is one that has real value and depth.
Meaningful. That is such a beautiful word. Listeners, I want to hear from you right now in the comments. Type the word listener if you have ever felt overwhelmed in an English conversation. We want to know how many of you are silent observers like Oliver.
It's about quality over quantity, Luna. One meaningful sentence is always better than 10 minutes of empty talking. When you speak less, people actually pay more attention when you finally open your mouth.
We are moving into our deep dive now, everyone. This is where things get really interesting. If you followed us this far, give yourself a pat on the back. We are stepping up the level to B2 English. This means more complex sentences and deeper ideas. Oliver, you mentioned that introverts have a secret map of a conversation. I want to talk about the psychology behind that. Why is it that being quiet actually helps our brain process a new language more effectively?
That's a brilliant question, Luna. It comes down to something called cognitive load. When you are an extrovert, your brain is often focused on the output. You are constantly searching for the next word, trying to keep the energy high and making sure there is no silence. But for an introvert, the focus is naturally on the input. Our brains are like high-powered sponges. While the extrovert is busy talking, the introvert is analyzing the sentence structure, the choice of vocabulary, and the emotional context of the speaker.
So while the world thinks we're just quiet, our brains are actually doing a massive amount of heavy lifting. It's like we are building a library in our heads while others are just shouting in the hallway.
Exactly. Let me tell you a story about when I first moved to a very high-pressure corporate environment in London. I was the only introvert on a team of shouters. Every morning meeting was like a battle of who could talk the most. For the first 2 weeks, I barely said a word in English during those meetings. I'll be honest, Luna, I felt like an imposter. I thought, they're going to fire me because I'm not contributing.
I was terrified that my silence was being interpreted as a lack of intelligence or a lack of English fluency.
Whispering. That is a very common fear. The imposter syndrome is real, especially when you're learning a second language. How did you flip the script?
I realized that because I wasn't talking, I was the only person in the room who actually knew what everyone else was saying. I started taking notes on the nuances, the small details. I noticed that my boss used certain idioms when he was stressed. I noticed that my colleagues often repeated themselves because they weren't listening to each other. So in the third week, during a very heated debate about a project, I waited for a natural pause. I used what I call the 3-second rule. I waited 3 seconds after someone finished talking, the room went quiet, then I summarized everything I had heard and offered one single solution.
I can imagine the reaction. You weren't just speaking English, you were providing synthesis. You took all that raw data and made sense of it.
Precisely. And that's the B2 level skill right there, active listening. Most people are just waiting for their turn to speak. Introverts, however, practice active listening. They hear the words, they feel the tone, and they process the intent. This allows them to respond with much more precision. If you're an introvert listening to this, understand that your silence is actually a period of intense rehearsal. You are practicing the language internally before you commit to it externally.
I love that concept of internal rehearsal. But Oliver, what about the pressure? Sometimes the silence feels heavy. People look at you and expect you to say something. How do we handle that gap without feeling like we're failing?
We have to reframe the gap. In many cultures, silence is seen as a weakness, but in high-level communication, silence is a power move. It shows confidence. When you take a moment to think before you speak in English, it tells the other person, I am considering my words carefully because I respect this conversation. It actually makes you look more fluent, not less. If you rush and make many mistakes because you're nervous, you lose authority. But if you pause, breathe, and then speak a well-constructed sentence, you command the room.
I can imagine the reaction. You weren't just speaking English, you were providing synthesis. You took all that raw data and made sense of it.
Precisely. And that's the B2 level skill right there, active listening. Most people are just waiting for their turn to speak. Introverts, however, practice active listening. They hear the words, they feel the tone, and they process the intent. This allows them to respond with much more precision. If you're an introvert listening to this, understand that your silence is actually a period of intense rehearsal. You are practicing the language internally before you commit to it externally.
I love that concept of internal rehearsal. But Oliver, what about the pressure? Sometimes the silence feels heavy. People look at you and expect you to say something. How do we handle that gap without feeling like we're failing?
We have to reframe the gap. In many cultures, silence is seen as a weakness, but in high-level communication, silence is a power move. It shows confidence. When you take a moment to think before you speak in English, it tells the other person, I am considering my words carefully because I respect this conversation. It actually makes you look more fluent, not less. If you rush and make many mistakes because you're nervous, you lose authority. But if you pause, breathe, and then speak a well-constructed sentence, you command the room.
That is such a psychological shift. It's moving from I'm quiet because I'm scared to I'm quiet because I'm processing. For our listeners, this is the introvert advantage. You have the ability to be more accurate and more thoughtful. Oliver, is there a specific technique you use to stay calm when you're observing?
I use a technique called grounding. I focus on the physical sensation of my feet on the floor. It stops the internal noise and allows me to focus entirely on the person speaking to me. I try to find one specific vocabulary pearl, a new word or phrase they use, and I try to mirror it back to them later in the conversation. It proves I was listening, and it helps me learn.
A vocabulary pearl. I love that. You are not just a student, you are a collector of language. This changes the whole dynamic of an English conversation. It's no longer a test, it's a treasure hunt.
Exactly. And introverts are the best treasure hunters because they're the only ones who are actually looking at the ground instead of shouting at the sky.
We are now moving into the C1 territory. This is for those of you who want to master the subtleties and the social nuances of English. Oliver, When we talk about high-level communication, people often associate it with being loud and charismatic. But there's a specific kind of power in being understated, isn't there?
Absolutely, Luna. In C1 level discourse, it's not about how many words you use, but the precision and the weight of those words. Introverts have a natural propensity for this because they're highly cognizant of the impact their words have on their interlocutor. Instead of just filling the air with filler words to avoid silence, they wait for the moment where their contribution will have the most resonance. This is what we call strategic presence.
Strategic presence. That sounds like a superpower. It's about being fully there, even if you're not the one speaking. It challenges the common preconception that introversion is a deficit or a communication barrier. In fact, in a professional or academic setting, being the person who speaks less but speaks with more nuance can actually make you more influential.
It creates an air of authority, Luna. If you are constantly talking, people naturally start to filter you out. But if you are someone who listens deeply and then offers a perceptive insight, you become the person everyone looks to when a decision needs to be made. It's about gravitas. You don't need a loud voice to have a heavy impact. It's the difference between a firework, which is loud and bright for a second, and a deep river, which is quiet but has incredible force.
That is a beautiful metaphor. Now it's time for our golden word of the episode. Today's word is eloquence. Now, most people think eloquence means talking a lot or using big words, but true eloquence is the ability to express a complex idea with clarity and grace, often using very few words. It's about the quality of the thought behind the language.
I love that choice. An eloquent person chooses the right word, not the most words.
And now I have a community challenge for all of you. Here's your mission. In your next English conversation, whether it's a meeting, a class, or a chat with a friend, I want you to practice the power pause. When someone asks you a question, don't rush to answer. Wait 2 full seconds, breathe, then start your response with, "That's an interesting point, and I've been thinking about."
That's a fantastic challenge. It forces you to be present and shows you're in control of the language rather than the language being in control of you.
Exactly. Share your experience with the power pause in the comments. Did it feel awkward, or did you feel more powerful? We want to hear your stories. It's time for our high-speed word tour. We have 60 seconds to lock these 5 linguistic gems into your long-term memory. Are you ready to fire them off, Oliver?
Ready as I'll ever be, Luna. Let's make these stick for our listeners.
Number 1, overwhelmed.
Feeling like a situation is just too much to handle. Example, I felt completely overwhelmed by the fast-paced conversation at the New York party.
Number 2, observe.
To watch and listen with deep intent. Example, introverts often observe the subtle body language of native speakers to understand the hidden context.
Number 3, synthesis.
The act of combining different ideas into one clear, powerful point. Example, she provided a brilliant synthesis of the 3 different arguments in the meeting.
Number 4, eloquence.
The quality of being clear, persuasive, and graceful in your speech. Example, his eloquence proved that you don't need a loud voice to be truly heard.
And finally, number 5, gravitas.
Having a serious, dignified, and influential presence. Example, the speaker's silence gave him an air of gravitas that commanded the entire room's respect.
5 words, 5 superpowers for your English journey. We've come to the end of our journey today, but your journey as a confident, quiet speaker is just beginning. Remember, your silence isn't a wall. It's a bridge to a much deeper understanding of the English language. Oliver, thank you so much for showing us the true power of the introvert's mind.
It was an absolute pleasure, Luna. To everyone listening, your voice matters, even and especially when it is soft. Trust your process.
Exactly. So go out there, take your power pause, and own your eloquence. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode of Speak English with Luna. Stay mindful, stay curious, and keep speaking your truth. See you in the next one. Bye!